funny how things have gone full circle in about 60 years. But the letter that you see here, I wrote when I was a bellhop here in 1949 as a ski bum, and really started this whole saga, you might say, off in one way or another. And I wanted to show you how the stationery looked, and it's quite interesting. Here's a picture of the drone, 1949. And what you see there is a car race that we used to every year have in those days. The Goethe Bicentennial, of course, was that same year. And that summer, I came back after my stint at the Jerome as a bellhop, and was working at the tent as a rope puller, and was able to see all the events that were there for the Schweitzer talks and the Goethe Bicentennial. So you see here, the tent was by Eros Saarinen, and we had barely a path to go through the weeds to go back and forth. That was the first year. So we need to start with a couple of readings. And Carrie's going to read the prologue. I'd like to.
Hi, thank you all for coming. In 2005, my father, Charles Paterson, sold the Boomerang, a ski lodge in Aspen, Colorado that he began as a small log cabin built into a 35-unit hotel and continually managed since he was in his mid-20s. Upon retirement from over 50 years in business, he began writing a memoir on index cards, episodes he had previously recounted for me in 2002 in a series of video interviews he titled Short Memories of a Long Life. Our friend Hensley Peterson, after hearing one of his tales around a campfire in 2008, encouraged him to expand his memoir into a larger book. She also began asking questions that led us to look more deeply into the history surrounding his life's events. And so it began. He started to go through old trunks, drawers, and collections of photographs, commencing to catalog his life. One day I found he had laid out all his hats in an arc by the piano. His efforts were accompanied by the clarity of my mother Fonda's bright memories and research. Over their 44 years of marriage, she has kept her own files filled with articles and references that give context to his stories and those of his father, Steve Schanzer, survivor of 2 world wars. Steve, my grandfather, was a legendary storyteller who inspired great affection and was an inspiration to many. When he emigrated to the United States in 1941, he changed the family name from Schanzer, with a C, to Schanzer. He said he wanted to drop the C in order to get the German out, as if he could banish from sight all the sorrows in his life that had been brought about by the Anschluss, Hitler's annexation in 1938 of our family's homeland, Austria. In this book, we have replaced the C in his name as a kind of restitution and amendment. My father Charles and my grandfather Steve are the central characters in this book. However, excerpts from the letters of other key figures help to fill its pages, including those from my father's sister, my aunt Doris Schneider, and a few rare memories from my grandmother Eva Beck Schanzer, who died in 1938. Midway through the writing of this book, amongst my grandfather's records, we found one dusty red file that had remained unopened for many years. My father knew the tattered folder contained all the correspondence between my grandfather and members of our family who died in Europe during World War II, my great-aunt Claire Beck Lohse, and my 2 great-grandmothers, Olga Feigl Beck and Rosa Schanzer, but he had never looked closely through the folder. My mother wanted to read the letters. My father protested. Despite my father's misgivings, my mother arranged for them to be scanned and translated. The letters were written in my father's native tongue, German, which he no longer speaks. Many were difficult to decipher because they were penned in Kirchenschrift, an old script based on German cursive writing from the late medieval period. My grandfather had kept them laid neatly together in chronological order, like a book he had not written but was responsible for delivering. With so many contributors to Escape Home, this book has become a chorus. The principal voices are a father and son separated by war and reunited, who shared a great love and were lucky to have each other. Some details of these stories have been challenging to write and others to make sense of, because even language can hide what has been lost, buried, or unspoken over the course of time.
In the introduction, I wrote the following. And the picture that you're looking at is Vienna. And what is that?
The Volksgarten, the Hofburg in the background.
At the time of the German annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, I was 9 years old. Our family lived in Vienna's 13th district.
We're getting feedback, aren't we?
As I learn about that year,
We're going to need some help.
okay. As I learn about that year and the violent manner in which the country was transformed almost overnight, I've changed the way I think about my childhood. I have no memory of the day the Nazis marched onto the Ringstrasse, but it altered my family's life forever. We were thrown to the winds. My father Steve, my uncle Max Beck, my sister Doris, and I survived to tell this story. In this book, we must all turn a page on tragedy, nevertheless, and recognize that vision, intuition, and hope are guides for people in the most terrible circumstances. I'm writing our story to give insight to what happened to people like us after our dispossession, and to tell how somehow, against all odds, we persevered and even thrived. I believe that young people today who see other times and their own difficulties can learn from our challenges, as I did from my father, that it takes courage and tenacity to carry on while you bring history with you. When I was born in Vienna in 1929, I was named Karl Schanzer, after my grandfather. I'm 8th generation in my family of Viennese. Through many twists of fate and the dramatic world influences that caused them, I became Charles Paterson, a Viennese Australian American. For the last 10 years, I've been rediscovering my past. As I recover from memories and letters, I've gained a new perspective on the history I've known, and my life is changing yet again. Since 1980, I've kept my father's papers and many of his personal effects in an old wooden filing cabinet in the basement of our house in Aspen that I designed and built in 1977 for my family. And I had rarely opened it since my father's death in 1979. At the outset of winter, soon after my retirement, I went rummaging through the cabinet. Then I found a treasure trove of letters in a stack of old, well-kept file folders. Like puzzle pieces, these letters, and many written in German and French, have provided the key to remembrances of a lost time and remain with me still and bring with memory this memoir alive. To my amazement, in addition to these letters, my father also kept all the correspondence I had ever sent to him from my first days in Aspen, starting in 1949, and from Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where I studied architecture under Frank Lloyd Wright in the late 50s. He also diligently kept copies of all his replies. The adventures we told each other through the years lay before me undiluted and unedited by memory. I'd never thought of that room as an archive for our lives and our relationship. Yet, I've been living with it right near my drafting room in my busy life all this time. And the discovery gave me great motivation to continue to work in this book, a time when I felt it was languishing. Later, my daughter Carrie and co-author and one of our editors, Cpl Paterson, delved a little deeper into the files in what looked to be a stack of old newspaper clippings. Carrie found my father's journal from 1914 to 1920, when he was made a prisoner in Siberia during the First World War. Hensley made the important discovery of all the letters sent by my sister and me from Australia to my father in New York when we were separated for over 8 years. My wife Fonda had always speculated that since my father kept everything, the letters must be buried somewhere. That amazing day, we retrieved my entire teenage years. Other exchanges with my father emerged, and from and to our foster family, and to advisors who enlightened my father, and now me as well, 70 years later, about the life and trials of children who escaped Europe during World War II. Our stories are part of a larger history. 1.5 million children and teenagers perished in that Holocaust, but thankfully, tens of thousands were, like us, sent away and rescued. Collectively, we are the last remaining witnesses of those tribulations. This book is an expression of my gratitude and, by proxy, my father's, to those who looked out for us and saved our lives.
So now I think we should turn to Vienna and go backward a little bit to understand Stephen Schanzer, one of the principal characters in the book. So we'll just keep flipping the page, the beginning of chapter 1.
I'll read you a paragraph at the beginning of that chapter. My father, Stefan Schanzer, was born in Vienna in 1889, as he used to say, the same year as Adolf Hitler. In the last generation of the Habsburg Empire, Vienna, a great mixing ground for ethnicities, religions, and nationalities, was at that time one of the most culturally diverse places in the world. As a destitute artist, Hitler lived a miserable life there for 5 years, starting in 1908. And from that experience, he formed his political opinions that would change the face and destiny of Europe. But my father never could, nor would, have blamed Vienna for what transpired to our lives. People, yes, but not the city. It was a singularly special place in his memories and a central jewel in all his stories and the heart of his identity.
A point of pride for Steve was that our relatives were among a small number of Jewish families, a few hundred people, granted special permission by the Habsburg monarchy to live in the city during the 18th century. We trace our ancestry back through one of the oldest recorded families, the Sinsheims. Steve's second great-grandfather, Abraham Lurie, who married Regina Sinsheim, was born in Vienna circa 1749 and went by the name of Goldstein, as he was a jeweler. This profession would have uniquely enabled him and his large family to live year-round in Vienna because jewelers were court-appointed to evaluate the worth of items being presented as collateral by citizens who sought loans from the emperor. This job provided an avenue for a kind of assimilation, possible in the empire but eventually exposed as a lie only decades after the fabric of the monarchy unraveled in the First World War. When power shifted again in the mid-1930s, people, like our family, who never considered they could be vulnerable to such charges, were labeled outsiders.
What you're looking at there is the house that we moved into in 1932. There were 70 homes at the Workmansiedlung in Vienna, where were built over 2 years, starting in 1930. Participating architects invited to submit designs included Joseph Frank, Gerrit Rietveld, Joseph Hoffman, Richard Neutra, and Adolf Loos, among others. There were 32 architects in all. The architectural styles throughout the Workmansiedlung, ours being no exception, emphasized a modern sentiment, utility over ornament, functionality over decorations, and luxury. My father told us that he and my mother bought the Workmansiedlung house with help of my grandfather Otto Beck. At the time, those houses, because of their unique showcase architecture, cost much more than the average home if calculated by square foot. At the Workmansiedlung, our lovely outdoor areas were filled with alpine flowers gathered during trips to the mountains by my parents and placed between rocks, as one would find in a natural setting. My parents took great pride in their garden and diligently labored there. They had both come from a city life of apartments, and so they enjoyed the greenery and this opportunity to cultivate an environment in which to raise our family. Now, we had an opportunity to live right here. This was a castle owned by my father's cousin, Baron Otto Pollock Panig, and he wanted my father and our family to move in to this place because he had all this extra room, as you can guess. But they chose to live a very simple and straightforward life, and they were more interested in having their own garden and their own place. So I just show that to you as this is called Schloss Laudon.
That's Schloss Laudon.
Schloss Laudon.
Yeah.
And it's just outside of Vienna. And what you see there is the Workmansiedlung, which was, this picture was taken in 1932, very soon after it was built. But now, of course, it's been built up around there quite a bit. And here you see the Loos house, and I might mention Adolf Loos was my uncle because he married my Aunt Claire Beck, who was my mother's sister. And he was a very famous architect in Austria and Czechoslovakia. And he built 2 duplexes, as you see them here. And also Richard Neutra, the only house.
Well,
Could you go back?
It's the back side of the
It's
Neutra
only
house,
the back side, I'm
unfortunately.
sorry. The front side is much more interesting.
Oops.
And it's the only house he built in Austria. Interestingly enough, he built very famous houses in California after he left Austria. This picture, as you see here, is obviously my sister and I standing in front of the house about 1936, I believe was the date of that.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the reception of the Workmansiedlung amongst the populace of Vienna? Oh, you want me to? Okay. So as you saw from the first slide of Vienna, that imperial architecture, large, stately, grandiose architecture is all over Vienna. Those of you who have been there know what we're talking about. As you can see, the Workmansiedlung is radically different. The houses are quite small, they're compact, they're very simple, they have no ornament on the outside. And when this modern housing experiment opened in 1932, there were 20,000 people that came over the course of the opening summer just to see it and tour it. And I believe you have some memories of that of
I
people?
remember people on weekends used to come and look at all the houses, and they would walk through this little enclave Saturday and Sunday. There were always groups of people taking pictures and going through. It was a tourist attraction, actually.
So in this picture, on your left-hand side would be that's relatively the area where the Neutra house is, and then just next to that was the Jacques Groag house, which is the architect who built the duplex or the Doppelhaus where my father grew up.
These, you might wonder about this cover. At the top of the cover is a picture of the ship that my father left Portugal when he came to the United States. And below it are the central characters of this book. My grandmother, Olga Beck, on the left, my father, obviously, and my sister and I. And this picture was taken in Pilsen, or just outside of Pilsen, in a resort. And the reason we show it, because we have to move along to, believe it or not, we're moving to Aspen.
So the importance of this photograph is this was only months, or perhaps even, yeah, it was only months after my grandmother, my father's mother, Eva Beck-Schanzer, died tragically in Vienna in June. And you can see on my grandfather's lapel, there's a little black stripe. That's a traditional Jewish mourning ribbon that represents someone who's been torn from the fabric of the family's life. So to see this photograph and see him wearing this was quite a discovery. My mom had done some research and noticed this little detail in the photograph, and that's one reason why it ended up on the cover. So if we can transition from Vienna and the escape from Vienna into Czechoslovakia, and then they escaped Czechoslovakia after seeing the Nazis invade Czechoslovakia, to France, we can go to our next episode.
I made a mistake. We're moving into something else here.
To France first.
Yeah, to France first.
I'm going to read you a letter that was written by my grandfather, Steve, to my dad from France after he had already achieved their adoption by the Paterson family in Australia. He writes, "Dear Charlie, I was very happy with your letter, for which I waited impatiently. The descriptions and locations of the places you saw are very interesting. I'm also glad to hear that you and Doris are well settled and that the troubles have finally disappeared. I would love soon to be able to say the same for me also, but I don't think it will be possible in the near future. Concerning my trip to Australia, the chances diminish from one day to the next, and I don't know what I will do. We will have to wait. Write to me again very soon, and I embrace you with all my heart. Papa." So Steve's own story unfolds here, told primarily through one letter he wrote to my aunt and my father when he had virtually only the clothes on his back and had made a dramatic 3-month escape by foot and bicycle from occupied France. Reading like a chronicle, this letter from Lisbon of dozens of pages describes the events ensuing from his capture by German soldiers on June 19, 1940. It was delivered to my aunt and my father in Australia via ship's captain nearly a year after it was written. Steve wrote his original story in German, envisioning his intended audience of émigrés and relatives, and in order to tell the story most expediently and in all its detail. Meanwhile, my Aunt Doris and my father began to lose their German and their French, necessitating that the letter be translated into English in Canada by another relative, Tommy Weiner, who had just been released from concentration camp, as we had read in a letter that we discovered.
And the picture you see there is my sister and I in a farmhouse in France, where we were at Saint-Marc-sur-Mer, which is near Saint-Nazaire. And as you see, we had very little, just barely a table and a few chairs, and that was it. Food, we were very lucky. The farmer supplied us with some of their crops from around the farm.
Do you want me to do this part, and then you can do the rest?
Okay. Carrie's going to go on with the story on that.
Steve needed to get permission to pass from one town to another while he was working in France, when they were in the south of France. Oh no, when you had already gone to Australia. But a June 1st air raid on Paris disrupted his plans. Upon fleeing west to Brittany during the evacuation, he was conscripted into the French army camp and assigned to work at a camp in Audierne. The German advance was frightening, he wrote, and quickly they had to face that Brittany had been cut off, knowing the Germans would arrive any camp, any...
Just change to Audierne.
Would you like to?
Yeah,
okay.
please.
There we go. This is Audierne, taken by me in 2011. Knowing the Germans would arrive any day and hoping to stay a step ahead, they were preparing to decamp when suddenly 3 German soldiers appeared on a hill nearby. 50 French soldiers in the camp all threw down their arms and surrendered. In a few minutes, the camp was occupied and everyone taken prisoner. The first order that followed was to separate Aryans from non-Aryans, who were then put under closest observation. The story begins at the critical moment when German soldiers turned their back on their new prisoners momentarily in order to look for water from the camp.
From our father's letter to us, 2 hours passed when suddenly I noticed that a few people were climbing over the 7-foot wall of the camp by means of a table. They were escaping behind the corner of a house, approximately 100 feet in front of a German machine gun that had been set up. The German guards were looking the other way. So I didn't hesitate. I went, as I was, without possessions or baggage, over the wall, and I was outside. How desperate the situation seemed. I was without resources and without documents, hundreds of miles behind the front. I didn't even know where the front was, or if there still was one up front. I had little cash, at least something, so I set about getting far away from the camp as I walked for a whole afternoon following the beach towards the south. I knew about 2 nearby fishing villages, and I had hopes of leaving for England on a fisherman's boat because I wanted to join my brother-in-law, Max Beck, who was already in London at this time. I walked the whole night, led by the stars. But that didn't work out with the boat across to England. So he bicycled, and there's a good story about all his entire trip. So now we moved to Aspen. One second. I always wanted my father to come and live with me in Aspen, and knew we had to take action to get him out of financial straits. It occurred to us at the same time that the mountain and fresh air would be a good move for him, and that he might live a healthier and longer life. He did live till he was 89. Years later, when his old friends in New York were ailing in their health, we commiserated and often remarked that how wonderful it was to live in the West, in the mountains. He used to tell his friends in New York, Charlie has a little cabin in the mountains with running water straight from the roof. The essence of my lifestyle was not lost on him. Everything I needed was right there at the cabin I built for myself. What came from the sky, as non-religious as we were, appeared like manna from heaven. So my father and I concurred that at his age, 62, he should finally leave New York, and he made a break from the big city and came to Aspen. We were reunited again and I was delighted to have him with me. It was in my effort to introduce my father to Aspen that I arranged to have a small lodge called the Holiday House from Margaret and Frank Day, Sr. And as you see here, Steve, in front of the original Holiday House, which was a Victorian and was moved to the east end of Aspen, and the buildings were rebuilt a number of times. Years after my father settled into his new Colorado life, he would tell the story that upon arriving in Aspen, he thought me crazy to settle in such a small and undeveloped town. He had actually said to me, "Are you crazy buying land in the wilderness?" After he heard that I bought the piece of land. But then he would add that after skiing for the first time down Ruthie's Run on Aspen Mountain, he understood everything and agreed wholeheartedly with my choice. He acclimatized easily to the idiosyncrasies of Aspen's small town life, with which he found parallels to Vienna, where he had enjoyed a robust social scene and almost everyone knew each other, as well as the surrounding Rocky Mountains. The snow and the pines reminded him of the Austrian Alps that he had loved so much. Aspen in the early 1950s was almost like a retirement for him, and though he was never going to stop working and seeing the world, he had come through an extraordinarily difficult period in his life, but it is remarkable that he never spoke of any sense of loss with me. It was a guarded, deep wound in his heart, scarred over purely by his own will to go on. His motto had always been to live life to its fullest, which implied not dwelling in a past he could not change. The hospitality business came naturally to Steve. As a transplanted Viennese, the fact that he liked people, enjoyed telling his stories, and loved to cook all worked well in perfect combination to make him a delightful, welcoming host. He possessed his own sincere brand of Gemütlichkeit and was warm-hearted, genuine, and open to people. No matter who was at the door, he would invite them in for food and cheer. His Viennese dishes were very popular, and in later years, that is how many people would remember him. He also cooked for those at his table with great aplomb and joy. And we have some of his recipes in the back of the book.
So this picture, just to fill in, this is my father and my grandfather cooking at the Holiday House. One of their, probably a Hungarian goulash, I would imagine, from what I can make out. What do you think? Hungarian goulash? Yeah?
Yes,
Likely?
He did that a lot. We served dinners for $2.50 at the Holiday House.
And so then your next foray was into the restaurant business.
Into the what?
Into the restaurant business.
Oh, yes. So here,
This is
we tried for 1 month in the restaurant business. And
no, one season.
well,
One
it
season.
wasn't even a season. No, it was a very, very short end of the season. And that picture here is where the Limelight stands today. So that's what that looked like. We did a little remodeling, and that was one of our helpers. I don't remember his name. And you see some of the lumber. It was very neglected. But we had friends around town, and they all came and supported us and came and ate dinner.
Imagine if all of you showed up for dinner tonight.
Schnitzels,
What would we have done?
Viennese schnitzels and goulashes, obviously. I still love the Wiener Schnitzel.
Not too much.
Not good. Not good for you. Aspen was still like the Wild West when I arrived to town. In early days, Aspen's police force consisted of one police officer, Kralichek, who was summoned by a unique method when he was needed at night. On the Hotel Jerome's rooftop, there was a searchlight. When he was required, one would call the hotel's front desk, and the clerk on duty would throw a switch for the light on the roof. This spotlight then shone on a large rock outcropping on Shadow Mountain directly in front of my cabin. The police and I were the first to know if there was any problem in Aspen after dark. The practice was finally discontinued in 1960. And we have a lot of these stories in the book. I'll tell you one more that is interesting. And there you see how they used to drive the sheep through town every spring to take them up to the high country. And that was taken right in front of my cabin. Then there was, okay, I'll just read one short paragraph.
Okay.
Then there was a two-vehicle taxi service, Little Percent Taxi, run by Natalie Guignou, consisting of one Jeep and one car. Natalie asked me to take care of the business for her one spring in early 1950 while she went on vacation. On those days, everyone left town from Mexico when the lifts closed. The communication system for taxis that were needed at the airport was that when a private plane came in, the pilot would fly low over Aspen, revving his engine 3 times if they need a lift to town. And on hearing this, I would drive out to the airport to pick them up. It was very basic, but it worked. Now, Benoit Lavoisier is back there. He has a little private plane, and he flies over occasionally. You see a little plane buzzing around, but he doesn't jump the engine 3 times. Now we go quickly to Siberia, believe it or not. We go to 1914, and Carrie, I'll have you read that. About the story about Siberia.
So the background to this is that in 1952, the son of the owners of the Holiday House, his name was Frank Day. He would have loved to have been here, but we got a regret email.
Yeah.
He took a transcript of my grandfather Steve telling stories about being a prisoner of war in Siberia and wrote all these things down, and we have, you know, this packet of stories from Siberia that we were able to include in the book and kind of weave that through to give some context to Steve and his character. So I think we should just jump into the first story.
Yeah.
Our prison camp in Dauria, this is Dauria, the barracks, was in a region stretching along the border between Siberia and China at the northern edge of the Gobi Desert. Some made attempts to escape the 7 miles to China, but all were failures because the Russians had an agreement with the Tunksi, a desert tribe. The Russians paid 50 rubles for every officer they brought back. Escape was impossible without a guide through the Gobi Desert, the only way out, where it was necessary to travel from one waterhole to the other. One of the Chinese smugglers that frequented the camp would offer to guide an escaping officer for 100 rubles. Then, at the first waterhole, the Tunksi robbed the officers, returned them to the Russians, and collected their reward. The prison camp held 600 officers and 4,000 soldiers, all from the Austro-Hungarian army. And this is just part of the millions and millions of soldiers that were captured on the Eastern Front. The Austrians had a strong sense of honor that was sometimes displayed amongst the professional officers, many of whom had quarrels. Normally, these would have been settled by a duel, but since we had no arms, a protocol was made. All duels would be settled when we got back to Austria. This entailed written agreements that were signed by high-ranking officers. And we found a book that that actually notes that there were railroad cars full of these documents that had to be pitched because they were needed to travel food and munitions and things like that.
I read you a short paragraph. We have to move along, I realize, and a lot of you might have to go somewhere else after this.
This is, by the way, I'm going to show you two journal.
While I think of it, we'll be
Pieces.
selling and signing more books after we get done here. Those people who we weren't able to do. About this time, I met a theater girl, Ducia Solivyenov, who lived in Chita. She was a Menshevik schoolteacher, extremely charming, blue-eyed and blonde. We had dates outside the camp, mostly near the river Igoda, where we picnicked. Any date with Ducia meant a considerable risk, and as I walked beyond the barracks, I was often shot at by the Internationalists, another warring group who had camps in the area. Ducia also came to my room, which was not without danger. Because of Ducia, I missed an opportunity to go home. And that was because there was a train that he could have jumped on, and his friends said, "Come, Steve, come, we're going on this train." And he said, "No, I can't, I have a date." And he spent, I think, 3 or 4 more years in Siberia, and he was sorry. As he said here, they told me to jump in, but I did not because I had a date with Ducia. Also, there were rumors that our whole camp would be transported soon to the west, which didn't happen. I didn't feel any urgency, so I said goodbye and watched them pull out. I would never get such an opportunity again.
And so his escape story from Siberia is also part of this book. This is the photo of when my father was in the Army. This is a comparison shot we just had to throw in of the Jamesways at Camp Hale. You could see the barracks compared. The barracks in World War I actually looked a little bit
Different
sturdier.
than the officers, prisoners of the Russian officers. Here's the enlisted man's abode, you might say, in Camp Hale. Now I had an opportunity to go to Taliesin, which was, as you see, Mr. Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright. And I wrote here, I arrived, this was my acceptance letter after I was accepted into school. I arrived at Taliesin the end of May 1958. I was now 28 years old. Immediately I felt that this green valley with its gentle hills was a special place, and I experienced the comfort of knowing that I would like it there and feel at home. I drove my car up to an open court behind which stood the imposing building that had been designed by Mr. Wright in the early 20th century for 2 of his maternal aunts, Jane and Nell Lloyd Jones, originally called the Hillside Home School. It was an expansion of their progressive coeducational boarding school and one of his first commissions. Later, it became part of the architectural school of Taliesin with an adjoining drafting room and theater. 3/4 of a mile away over the hill was the Wrights' beautiful home named Taliesin after a famous 6th century Druid bard, and also meaning shining brow. Aptly named, the house hugs the crest of the hill. One of the Wrightian principles is to integrate the building with its site, so it is of the hill instead of on the hill. The house appeared from a distance as one approaches on the road, is mirrored on the water of a beautiful man-made lake with a waterfall cascading at the edge. Wright's genius in planning is evident everywhere.
So we just wanted to do a quick photo essay of Taliesin, which involves a lot of photos that my father took, including that one of the Hillside Home School. And this is, do you want to talk about this
Well,
quickly?
the apprentices all worked at the same time as learn by doing was the motto, and taking care of the garden. This was a triangle in front of the house as the road branched off to his house. And every morning we spent a half an hour pulling weeds in this beautiful spot. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Wright at a picnic. And myself doing some work, doing some plastering outside the house.
This is outside of Mrs. Wright's bedroom, I think you said?
Yes, it was. And my room.
Oh, can we look at this? Can you see the ski photo there? On the
And the drafting room. And when I had my launch in LA, the apprentice that you see here in the foreground was at my launching in LA, and he's now, of course, a lot older than you see him here, but he was so delighted to see the picture.
It was a
He
surprise.
invited us for lunch and showed us his house, which they had built, and was very interesting. And he's a very excellent architect.
Louis Wheely is his name.
Louis Willie.
Of Wheeler Car.
At that time, we knew him as Alvin.
Yeah.
People changed their names in Taliesin.
So we didn't realize he was coming to the event, and this slide came up, and then my father was able to say, and this man in the photograph is right there in the second row. That was nice. Here's my father in the same drafting room, working on, guess what project? This is the final project at Taliesin.
And you see the boomerang.
His graduation project, thesis project, you could say.
Presentation drawings of the boomerang, which I worked on for 3 years. And as you see there, these were the drawings that I had under my arm when I applied for a loan at the Small Business Administration. And I was the first one to get a business administration loan into Aspen. And here you see the boomerang. This was how it looked, about vintage of 19, I don't know what
60?
year.
60?
19, I would say 70,
Oh, that late.
1970, yeah.
The ski, but you want to talk about
No, you go ahead.
the ski pickup van, the van that would go to pick up skiers was this remodeled hearse with that had the roof painted gold that my grandfather would call the golden Dockel, which is, anybody from Vienna might know the story of Emperor Maximilian in his golden Dockel. There's a roof of gold over his observation tower in the palace where he could look out on everyone, all of his subjects. So that gave you a sense of the generosity and the way they wanted to treat their guests at the Boomerang. You're the emperor when you arrive, even though it's a hearse.
I might add that we were one of the first lodges in Aspen to transport skiers to the slopes. But unfortunately, I had to give up this beautiful car because one of my guests, lady, wouldn't get in. Her husband was a doctor, and she said, I'm not getting into a hearse. So
And that was it.
that was it. We got a different
curtains
vehicle.
for the hearse.
Okay. This was what started everything, the cabin in 1949 on my piece of land that I bought, and I built that summer. So the whole Boomerang was built around this building, believe it or not. And you can see me at work when...
You were doing a cabin expansion. The small
Yep.
cabin became a slightly larger cabin where both my sister and I grew up in our very early years at the Boomerang. There's a slightly off-color photograph, if you can see my father and my grandfather there with another guest by the fireplace. There's somebody sitting there by the lake.
Oh, yes, they were holding the... Well, the lake actually is a swimming pool and built out of tar paper.
The first Boomerang pool. And that's the interior of the cabin as it was rented at the Boomerang years later.
And this is Fawn and I on our way off to our honeymoon in Mexico.
1969.
1969. And our upper lounge in the lodge.
And the famous pool, which has been recently written about in the Aspen Daily News. I don't know if people saw that article, but we had a wonderful column come out, somebody that remembered the pool and knew nothing about the book, knew nothing about Frank Lloyd Wright, learned all these bits and pieces of the story, and then wrote a column. It was very nice.
And we had a lot of fun with the underwater window. So there, I'm sitting here in my ski school sweater, and as I was teaching skiing, still in most of my pupils ended up going to the boomerang, because we always promoted the boomerang while I was skiing, of course, in my classes. And one day I decided to ski into the pool, and we had a lot of fun that way. This is more an up-to-date picture of the boomerang. And
this, we're going to end with a...
Just write a little bit about this.
Oh, I'll read a brief bit about the construction of the lodge, and then we'll end with a nice letter that was sent to my father by a former guest. The construction of the lodge was unique enough that it caused some consternation for the block layers. The battered walls, which you can see this block stepping outward, for the ends of the building and the upper lounge were meant to step outward, so the concrete blocks had to be offset a ½ inch off on each course. The engineering and steel reinforcements had to be exacting, or the walls would have collapsed. Mr. Wright had done battered block walls on several single-story buildings, but rarely on taller structures. It turned out to be quite an accomplishment when the walls held up successfully according to my father's design and did not tumble down. Using masonry in this way was a new look at the time and made the building special and much admired. And then the book goes into some of the press and somewhat of what other people were saying about the lodge and yeah, some of the articles that it got written up, where it got written up.
So I'll end along here with a letter that was not that reached me. Actually, it was an article written by a 15-year-old boy for his high school. What do you call it? His high school graduation.
No, it was a paper. It was a paper he had to write in an English class,
Right.
I believe.
Right.
Okay, so I'll read a little bit and then I'll pass it over. The Boomerang Lodge, a retro hotel where we stayed with my grandmother, fills my mind with memories and dreams. The author of this is Slide Kelly, his name is. It was a relatively small building, semicircular with innumerable entrances and hallways. The Boomerang was always crowded but deserted at the same time, making me feel like I had the whole place to myself. It was a little slice of heaven for an 8-year-old. My grandmother had a habit of waking up early to go to the early risers continental breakfast they always had at the Boomerang. The few times I actually woke up, we sat at a perfectly tiny table in a small room that had a gigantic window facing snow-capped peaks. Sipping fragrant teas and reading the paper, my grandmother would skim slowly for events down at the music tent. She would drag us there hours later, coloring books in hand, to listen to angelic music that resonated from somewhere beyond the picture of a train that I was fervently coloring blue. We would spend hours at the pool, my brother and I, making faces at each other through the glass window that looked into a comfortable underground lounge. We would continue this until an elderly housekeeper would shoo us away, scolding us for being wet in the lounge. Then, defeated, we would soak in the hot tub, enveloped in an aromatic mist, until we became wrinkled as raisins. One summer, the Boomerang was fenced off with large construction signs around the perimeter, where there used to be a magical pool shining a luminescent turquoise glow into the lounge below. There's now just a gaping hole. A part of me seemed to be taken out when the hole was dug, a vital part of my childhood missing in the rubble. So I will never forget the Boomerang Lodge, and I hope that I will live to see the hole filled and the Boomerang return.
After 50 years of nurturing and building a business, a heart condition helped make the decisions to finally sell the lodge in 2005. We celebrated 50 years in business with a huge garden party to which the whole town was invited, Speeches were made, tears were shed, and many old guests and friends stopped to drink champagne, eat Viennese pastries, and sign our guest book. A lot of you are here in the house right now. The new developers allowed the Wrightian building to be designated historic so that it can be preserved. As I released the boomerang from my possession, I was gratified to see there might be a new beginning for it as a landmark. The other 2/3 of the buildings are no more. This includes the cabin. We could not move it off the property because it shared too many walls with the rest of the lodge, its massive fireplace, a kind of monument to my first days settling the land, would have fallen to pieces. I went over to take photos as all the buildings came down. The boomerang became a pile of logs and stone, the materials returning to a natural state of entropy, just as they were before I came along. It was my life's work gone in days. The last thing standing on the third building was the elevator shaft, a battered concrete block tower of 3 stories rising out of the rubble like a temple. As of this writing, the property still waits to be transformed. One more paragraph.
We are broken down before we can rebuild. The same is true for all ideals. My father, sister, and I'm reading in my father's voice, sorry. my Charlie and Doris and Steve fled Europe as the social democratic experiment collapsed. They came to America to find new lives, but everything they knew came with them and became elements they wove into all they did. Uncertainty and vulnerability are the given circumstances the Jewish people have lived with for thousands of years of dislocation and resettlement. They are also strengths. The circularity of this history requires a language and an oral history to bring the past to reflect on the future in a meaningful way. Stories can survive even beyond buildings, but they need people to carry the words. We'll leave you with that.
Thank you.
This epilogue photograph I found, this is my grandfather Steve with my sister Jenny in probably what is 1977 in the cabin on the Siberian bed, which is a very special construction of a couch that he learned how to make in 1914. Thank you so much.
Still signing books